All right, we're back, and in this segment, we're going to talk about gender identity and gender expression and how they interact with each other. So we just got done talking about gender identity, and just to recap, that's how the person internalizes their sense of masculinity or femininity, whether they more align with the traditional male or the traditional female roles, those kinds of things. Gender expression, on the other hand, is how we present ourselves to the world. And a lot of times in our presentation, we want to be perceived in a certain way, but it's not necessarily the case that the world perceives us the way we're intending for them to perceive us. So we're going to focus on how the person is presenting themselves, not how the world's necessarily receiving them. So gender identity can range from masculine to feminine, with androgyny being in the middle, and it's a continuum. There are different ways to measure a person's androgyny or their gender identity. I've used two of them in my research. One is the BEM sex role inventory, and the other one is the I'm blanking on the name of it. It's called like the PRF androgyny scale. And with the BEM one, it's a series of adjectives that have been historically associated with males or historically associated with females. So on the male side would be things like, bold and assertive and leadership. And on the female side would be things like dependent and submissive, things like that, and soft-hearted. And on the PRF one, it's more like situations. Like, if you saw a baby, would you ask to hold it? Things like that. I've used both of them, like I've said, and I collected data on probably 300-ish, probably more than that, participants using the BEM sex role inventory. And I collected data on probably 250 to 300 people using the other androgyny scale. And what I found is very, very few people scored in the masculine or in the feminine category. Almost everybody fell into the androgynous category. I think there's this myth that everybody is walking around in these binary gender identities except for a few people. And it's like, I think it's flipped. I think the vast majority of people have characteristics that have historically, traditionally, stereotypically been associated with the other sex, right? I mean, there are women who are very bold and assertive, and there are men who are, very soft-hearted. And I mean, it's just, people vary. On that PRF one, I administered it to my husband and myself just because I was going to use it for research. And I was like, let's see how this works. And he actually scored higher. When we had kids, little kids, is when I administered it. I wonder if he'd score differently today now that the kids are grown. But when he was, in the midst of being the stay-at-home dad with the kids, he scored higher on the femininity side of it than I did. And, the question, would you ask to pick up somebody else's kid? I was like, no, I don't want to hold somebody else's baby. Thank you. And he was like, oh yeah, I love kids. And I mean, that kind of is exemplary of why he was willing to stay home and I wasn't. But people tend to be in that androgynous part of that scale, and that's a continuum too. So you can be androgynous leaning towards femininity, or you could be androgynous leaning towards masculinity, or you could be smack in the middle and you're showing just as much masculinity as you are femininity. And I saw students and respondents of all those different kinds of combinations when I was collecting my data, and I saw very few purely masculine or purely feminine. When I say very few, I mean like maybe 5% of my respondents. Now with gender expression, this is what you're putting out and wanting to be perceived by. So you're expressing your gender through your behavior, your style of dress, things like that, the way that you speak, things like that. So again, it can range from masculine to feminine. And then in the middle, there's different names for what you would call people who are in the middle. And it's really idiosyncratic. Different people want to be called different things. So I just listed two, non-binary or genderqueer, two examples of the kinds of terms that people might use if they're in the middle. But again, research is showing that the vast majority of us show behaviors that are putting us into that middle continuum more often than purely masculine or purely feminine. I mean, if you think about style of dress, right? Now, there's a lot more rigidity for men as far as style of dress. Like, women can wear pants or dresses, or, they have a lot of freedom in what they can wear. Men are a little bit more rigid. They're supposed to wear pants. But, it's becoming a lot more flexible. Like the style of shirt that they can wear has become, there's a lot more variety of what's completely fine for men to wear. Things like that. But I think women have a little bit more flexibility in style of dress. Men have gotten a lot more flexibility in length of hair than they used to have, right? And you know what? That was a brief little period where men were supposed to wear short hair, because historically men had longer hair. Then we went through this little period, maybe when barbers came along and had sharp scissors, I don't know, and everybody's supposed to have short hair. And then now we're back to, varieties of length of hair. Around the world, different styles of dress are associated with the two sexes and stuff. And so, the more that our cultures come together and we see, hey, there are other things we could be wearing, it's put more of us more towards the middle. Things like, men who wear eyeliner or women who wear short hair. I mean, these are good examples of people who maybe they wouldn't call themselves non-binary, but they actually are more towards the middle. They aren't showing exclusively masculine or exclusively feminine characteristics. Well, let's talk about how these interact. So if you are, leaning towards the masculine gender identity and leaning towards the masculine gender expression, that would be called, masculine and, gender conforming. So that, these two things are in alignment. And especially if you are male, that is definitely gender conforming, right? So you've got the sex of male, identity and expression that's leaning towards masculine, gender conforming. If, on the other hand, if you're male or you're female, so that's what that little symbol is supposed to indicate, is you could be either male or female. That's what I mean by it in this context, at least. But you're showing a masculine gender identity and a feminine gender expression, then we would call you gender nonconforming. So if you're leaning towards masculine and leaning towards feminine, gender nonconforming. And same thing, if you're leaning towards masculine and you're leaning towards feminine, gender nonconforming. And then if you're female and you're leaning towards feminine, then you would be gender conforming. So this is just a big block sort of gloss of how, you end up with kind of really three types of people, right? Where you've got masculine, feminine, and then gender nonconforming, because you're sort of in the middle, right? You're showing some of each thing. So that's one way to kind of construe how gender identity and gender expression kind of work together to produce a person who is either gender conforming or not. Now let's talk about some of the gender stereotypes that float around, and let's talk about the evidence for whether they are more or less valid. So let's start with aggression. All right, so when we talk about aggression, first off, let's make sure we're really specific what we mean by aggressive behavior. So in this chart, this is kids. So we've got the blue bar is boys and the red bar is girls. And then we have different types of aggressive behavior. So we've got resisting authority, yelling and teasing, harming property, and harming people. And so first thing you'll notice is that resisting authority and yelling and teasing are more common than harming property or harming people. You'll notice that girls are more likely to resist authority and yell and tease than they are to harm property or harm people. Much more likely. Everybody's more likely to resist authority, yell, and tease than they are to harm property. But boys are more likely to harm people than girls are, for sure. Like boys are much more likely to behave aggressively, physically aggressively towards people than girls are. Now in this one, we're looking at different grade levels. So we have boys who are in grades 5 and grades 8 in the blue bars. So light blue is grade 5, dark blue is grade 8. Yellow or amber is girls in grade 5, and red is girls in grade 8. And then we see on the y-axis percent of children described by their peers as aggressive. And then we have the different types of aggression. So now they're different from what they had been over there. We've got physical aggression, verbal aggression, social ostracism, and then malicious rumors. And so what you see for the physical aggression is that boys are way more likely than girls at both grade levels to display physical aggression. And 5th grade boys are much more likely than 8th grade boys, but both are way higher than girls. Verbal aggression appears to be non-sex discriminatory. It looks like verbal aggression, boys and girls engage in it. 5th grade boys more than anybody else, but all this, both sexes engage in verbal aggression. Now, social ostracism is when you make a person feel like they don't have any friends. They can't be part of your group. That old thing that you hear kids say all the time, if you don't do it, I won't be your friend, kind of thing. So social ostracism seems to be the aggression of choice for girls. You can see that hardly at all do boys do it, and definitely by grade 8, rarely. You barely can see that bar at all. Malicious rumor seems to be the grade 8 girls' specialty. The younger kids and the boys not spreading malicious rumors like the girls in grade 8 do. And if you combine spreading malicious rumors as a way to socially ostracize somebody, you've got a lot of aggression going on among those 8th grade girls, where they're trying to basically harm their peer by leaving that peer with no friends and no support. Right, I'm spreading malicious rumors so nobody will like you and you'll be alone and I win. So it's really super important if we're going to talk about whether there's a difference between the sexes on aggression to say, well, what do you mean by aggression? Because if the only thing you mean by aggression is like hitting someone, well, yeah, boys are more likely to do that. If you're going to say aggression is what we mean by aggression, and we're going to talk about this in another chapter, but which is intentionally harming someone else, well, we don't see that much of a sex difference, do we? We see as much verbal aggression between both sexes. We see way more social aggression among girls and physical aggression among boys. So they have different types of aggression that they engage in, but they're both aggressive. All right, how about some other gender stereotypes having to do with body language? You may not have ever thought about these things before, so some of this might be kind of surprising to think about. We find that men do less facial expression. They smile less, for one thing. They do less, eyebrow movement. They do less like grimacing as a nonverbal response to like surprising information or something. They just do less facial expression than women do on average. Men do not like to maintain eye contact unless they're using it as a dominance thing. Like it's either dominance or sexual interest. Like those are the two choices for male eye contact. Otherwise, they don't really want to have a lot of eye contact. Women like eye contact. When you look at two women who are friends and they're talking to each other, they tend to be facing each other while they talk, and they look at each other the whole time, and they look each other in the eye, and they check each other's facial expressions and things like that. And of course, with women having more expressive faces, it's probably more information when it's two women talking to each other if they actually look at each other, because they're going to be making facial expressions. Men, on the other hand, if you look at two men who are talking to each other, a lot of times they're sitting next to each other and looking out over something. They're not looking at each other. Maybe they're engaging in some kind of activity while they're talking, and they don't look into each other's eyes. Unless there's about to be an argument or a fight, then suddenly I'm going to hold your eye contact because, now I'm serious. Or if I'm showing sexual interest as a male, then I would hold eye contact. But otherwise, they really don't want to engage in that. Posture. Men tend to be a lot more relaxed in their space than women are. If you look in a public place at men and women and how they're sitting, and just do a little observation of them, don't let them know you're staring at them, you'll notice that women are much more likely to have their legs crossed, for one thing. They may even have crossed their legs so much that they've actually not only just crossed one leg over the other, but now they've wrapped their foot around their bottom part of their leg. Whereas men hardly ever cross their legs. If they do, it'll be like their foot on top of their knee, and their top knee is sort of splayed out, so they're actually taking up more space. Or they sit with their legs apart. Women rarely do that. Men oftentimes will relax by putting their hands on the back of their head and interlock their fingers so their elbows are out to the side. So again, they're taking up more space. Women, you hardly ever see women doing that gesture, unless they're like exasperated or something, but men will just do it to relax. Men will sit with their shoulders a lot more square. Women a lot of times will roll their shoulders forward so as to take up a little less space. These are things people are doing completely unconsciously. Nobody's saying, oh, I need to be as small as I can. Oh, I need to be as big as I can. It's just, you can see a difference between men and women out in the world. Just check and see how they're behaving, and you'll see that men tend to take up more space. They're more relaxed in the world than women are on average. What do they call that? Man spreading or something? But I don't mean it like that. I mean, just honestly, you see this difference, and lots of observational studies have reported that on average men just are more relaxed and take up a little bit more space. Bodily proximity. Again, for men, on average, they want a bigger bubble. We talked about personal space before, and men are going to push it more towards the 6-foot personal space, whereas women are more willing to get towards that 3-foot personal space, even with somebody that they don't know that well. But again, there's like that caveat, because for men, bodily proximity, well, now, am I sexually interested? Am I about to fight? Because now bodily proximity can get a little closer, right? Whereas for women, they can be closer, even with people they don't know well, they're willing to get a little nearer. Touching in general for men is reserved for either, again, fighting or sexual interest. Like, these are the two times that we spend any time touching. Whereas women will do more touching to, express warmth, or express friendship or support or something like that. So men are less likely to just, want a hug, than women are on average. So, it's really important when we talk about gender stereotypes, and I'm trying to clarify some that are probably valid and some that are probably not. It's really important, again, to just reiterate that these are averages, and all of us vary around those averages. And so, there are bigger differences between women than there are between men and women, and between men than there are between men and women. So the group differences exist, but the individual differences you can't assume are going to be there, right? Like, any individual who you meet could deviate one way or another away from the averages. So just keep that in mind, that I'm not trying to really embrace stereotypes. I'm just trying to tell you what the data has shown, and then you guys have to keep remembering, if I didn't say it, what it means on average. All right, so we've got some sex differences in aggression and body language in certain ways. How about helping? And we're going to talk about altruism later in another chapter. So just to give you a little foreshadowing, males are much more likely to help strangers, and females are a lot more likely to help family and friends. So both sexes turn out to be equally helpful. It's just who they help, and then also kind of the context in which they'll help. Like, men are much more likely to help in what I would consider to be dangerous situations. And females are much more likely to help in more ongoing and enduring situations. So there are differences in how they help and who they help. Conformity. There are no sex differences in conformity. This is something that a lot of people have. In fact, I think it's one of the BEM sex role inventory adjectives that women are more conformist. That's the female stereotype word, but the data doesn't bear that out. There are no sex differences in conformity. Both sexes want to fit in. Both sexes look for clues and cues about how they should be acting. Personal entitlement, it again depends on what you're talking about. Both sexes think that they are entitled to things in certain circumstances, and that other people are entitled to things in other circumstances. Like, it varies. So, for example, with regard to income, what's the word I'm looking for? Salary. That's the word I'm looking for. Salary. Males are more likely to ask for a higher salary than females are. Females oftentimes don't feel as entitled to ask for a raise, when in fact they are entitled because they have earned it. They're less likely to ask for it than males are. So there's that, right? There's this difference in that. Women, on the other hand, they feel more entitled to help. They will ask for help, or they'll be disappointed when somebody doesn't offer help. When men will assume that, why would anybody help me with this? For example, women are more likely to think that if they're carrying something heavy, that somebody will help them out by opening a door for them, whereas men are more likely to think, I'm supposed to do this myself. So there's just like those kinds of little bit of differences between men and women as far as personal entitlement. Verbal behavior. Interrupting. I always like to ask my class in person, which sex do you think interrupts more? And it's mixed. It seems like the men think the women interrupt more and the women think that the men interrupt more. So, but it turns out objectively, when they look at actual dyads, which are pairs of people talking, that men interrupt more to take the floor. So they're like, I already know where you're going and now I want to start what I want to say. Whereas women are more likely to interrupt to show support. So the person's telling the story and the woman's more likely to say, oh yeah, I get that, or I understand, or other words that are actually not derailing what the person's saying but are encouraging it. Male speakers find that derailing though, so it feels like an interruption to them. And female speakers who get interrupted by a male to take the floor away from her, they feel like that's an interruption for sure. But yeah, so the two sexes do say things while another person's talking, but the type of interruption is quantitatively different. The other thing there, gossiping, it turns out the stereotype is that women gossip. And of course, I think it's probably a reasonable extension of that malicious rumor spreading that happens around grade 8, right? Where suddenly you're passing around messages about, Susie was doing something in the bathroom or whatever. But when you compare the content of what men and women talk about with their friends when they're not, doing business or being professional or something, they're just talking, it turns out that both sexes gossip at the same rate. What they gossip about can vary by sex, though. Men, oftentimes, they don't perceive it to be gossiping when they're talking about, let's say, a friend, a coworker. They're talking to their friend about a coworker and talking about, the coworker's slack work, and yet he got a promotion or something like that. The man oftentimes doesn't feel like it's gossip because it's just information. I'm not trying to make my friend hate my coworker who they don't even know. I'm just telling them about my work day. Whereas when they hear a woman telling a story very similar to that, the male will think that that's the woman gossiping maliciously. It turns out both sexes tell those kinds of stories. I mean, we do that, and we all do it because we all want to hear from somebody else that we're not wrong. And that the other person's wrong. And it's not necessarily to make somebody else hate, it's not a malicious rumor. It's just us talking about somebody else. Men also do a lot of talking about like famous people, and then they think that that's not gossip. And, if you objectively measure gossip as talking about another person who's not here to defend themselves, it doesn't matter whether they're famous or not, right? It doesn't matter if it's a ball player or a politician or a CEO or something. It doesn't matter. It's a person who's not here to defend themselves. So that technically is gossiping. So it turns out that both sexes gossip, and pretty much at the same rate. So a lot of similarities, but also like these little nuanced differences between what males and females tend to do. So kind of tying this back to evolution, because a lot of times people think that gender and gender roles are only there because culture imposed them. But culture often reinforces gender roles that may have originated with biological demands. Like if you think about it, why would a culture have, let's say, a division of labor for males and females? Like why would that have even happened? Well, maybe women became the gatherers because they needed to stay closer to home because they had children, their own, or, the clan's children that needed to be watched, and you can't be toting little kids around here and there, and they're vulnerable to predators and whatever. So maybe they became the gatherers because it made more sense. They could take the kids with them, they could keep an eye on them. It just made more sense. And men were the hunters because they didn't need to be staying at home. They weren't nursing anyone. They weren't currently pregnant, right? And so the division of labor may have naturally emerged just based on this reproductive demand that males and females differ on. It may be that, because men are physically stronger and because a lot of hierarchical stuff occurs through intimidation, men became the patriarchs because they were able to control, usurpers and stuff like that. I mean, you look at other animals. I just watched this horrible nature documentary where these two giraffes were fighting with each other, and it's like the world's most slow motion beating that they gave each other using, I didn't know those things on their heads had actual horns inside of them, and they were gouging each other really badly with them. The males of all species fight with each other to gain access for reproduction and other things. And so the evolutionary theory says maybe that's how patriarchy starts, right? Is that you were powerful enough to chase off the other males, and so then now we have the females who are intimidated, and this is how it starts, right? And then it gets codified by culture. So it's possible, though, that cultures are showing similarities in gender roles and things like that, because they all ended up settling with similar solutions to a common problem. That it maybe it's not evolved differences that we're seeing between cultures, but instead there are similar problems across all cultures. Like there are reproductive demands on females that make them, less likely to be the hunters in a clan or whatever. And so maybe independently and all around different cultures, the same basic solutions were offered because the problems were very similar, right? And so it's really hard. It's a chicken and the egg question. Do we act the way that we do today because culture told us to, or did evolution tell culture this makes the most sense, and then it just sort of became our norms and we're just passing them along as memes? It's really hard to know. So I thought I'd highlight the individualism and collectivism issue one last time, and now I want you to do it through the lens of gender. So let's look at what are the definitions of individualism. And look, we've got independent, looking for your own uniqueness, personal achievement and fulfillment, rights and liberties, self-esteem, changing reality, having relationships that are temporary and casual. I don't know if that's relevant, but maybe. Behavior that reflects one's personality and attitudes. If you had to pick one of the sexes to say which one it sounds more like, which sex would you say individualism sounds more like? But what about collectivism? Interdependent, maintaining connections, fitting in, performing your role, having group goals and solidarity, accommodating to reality, having social networks, having fewer friends, but they're close and enduring, and you really want to, maintain harmony. Which sex does that sound more like on average? I'm not talking about any individual. I'm just saying on average, which sex would you say that sounds more like? On average, males in all cultures tend to be more individualistic than the females in all cultures. Females tend to be the more collectivistic members of all the societies. So when we talk about the fact that we have on average societies that are more individualistic, you have to remember that within the society we have a lot of variation between people, and one big dividing factor is what sex they are. On average, females are more collectivistic, and on average, males are more individualistic. All right, that concludes our chapter on gender. So hopefully you found some of that stuff interesting, and I will see you in the next chapter.